Hey guys, welcome to SIH Capital Group's monthly webinar series. We are in the month of May. Can't believe we're in May already. Super pumped. Today we have Taylor on. Taylor, for those who are not aware of what Taylor does, is it's a super interesting twist on what we do, where we do real estate syndications. There is a world out there that does Scotch syndications, and Taylor's I would say one of the, and especially my network is the go-to source of questions that I have when it comes to this space. So I just wanted to bring him on. He's going to share a little bit of his background and kind of get into this, introduce our listeners to this unique space. So Taylor, awesome to have you on. Thank you so much for being here, first of all. And just want to give you the platform just to introduce yourself, and then let's see where the conversation goes.
Sure. Excited to be here, Dennis. And it was good to meet you. We actually had Dennis come by the Braeburn Whiskey Vault in Midtown Manhattan a couple of months back, which is where I met him for the first time, which is right behind me, by the way. Not a fake background. This is our beautiful office space on 57th Street. So anybody in the New York City area, we'd also love to have you by. But for background on me and my firm, I run Braeburn Whiskey in the United States. And Braeburn is a global organization and the foremost whiskey investment firm in the world. We've been in business for close to 8 years, bringing whiskey to investors in every single continent. And in the last year or so, I've finally been able to have whiskey offered as a security in the United States, as is required by Securities and Exchange Commission rules for this type of a private investment. Whiskey investment's been going on in Scotland and in Ireland and even to a degree in America for decades, if not hundreds of years, but it's been largely an insider's game, only available to whiskey distillery owners, friends, partners, and employees. It's a very attractive asset class for anybody that is unfamiliar with it, and we'll talk a little bit about it. But our goal was to bring whiskey to people that normally don't have access, which is why we came here to America to fulfill our manifest destiny as we've always seen it. That's us. We're the world's international whiskey investment specialist dealing in Scotch and Japanese whiskey in the barrel.
In the barrel. And that's an important distinction, right? You guys are not selling, you guys are not brokering like bottles, right? You're not going to be buying a 25-year-old Scotch with you guys, but you guys can source unique barrels across, a couple different continents now these days, right, Taylor?
Yeah, there's a lot of ways to make money in whiskey, just like everything else. Some people might buy a distillery or buy shares in a distillery, which is a business which has its own interesting complications and risks. Some people do collect bottles and consider them to be investments. There are some challenges there, but some people do make some good money in that. Our focus is exclusively on whiskey in the cask or in the barrel. And the reason why we deal in whiskey in the barrel is because not only is it the fundamental unit of the whiskey industry and ecosystem and economy, but a barrel is the only way you can actually age and mature and improve a whiskey. I mean, you're kind of a whiskey guy, right, Dennis?
I am.
Yep.
Unfortunately, I love it, and due to health conditions, I have to limit it. But yes, it's definitely my go-to choice when I'm relaxing.
Yeah. Well, so then generally speaking, whiskey guys, your friends, when possible and when you can afford it, you're probably going to go for an older whiskey, right? Something that's been aging longer.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and you'll pay more for it.
Usually, yeah.
Well, that's the whole idea. Whiskey in a barrel matures as time goes on. So if an investor can buy a barrel of Scotch or Japanese whiskey when it's relatively young, or if possible, even brand new, we help them hold and take care of, maintain, and protect their barrels in government bonded warehouses in either Scotland or Japan as long as they want for several years. And then eventually our investors will sell their barrels on to the next buyer, an investor or a bottling company, or back to the distillery and take their profit home. And the profit comes from the fact that maturing whiskey, the older a whiskey gets, generally speaking, the more valuable it can become. Not only that, obviously, inflation increases commodity prices, consumer prices, and the prices of bottles on the shelf. So that impacts our investors' bottom line positively. But probably most importantly, especially if you can be a longer term investor, is the scarcity factor, right? Whiskey is a consumable spirit. It's a beverage. People are going to drink this stuff. So the longer you can hold something, the less of that whiskey there is going to be around. So scarcity really, really drives valuations and appreciation in the whiskey market, especially if you can be in that mid to long term range. So that's all there is. It's like any other commodity or financial asset, long term capital appreciation, buy, hold, sell. That's all there is to it.
So Taylor, just to go to the basics, right? Is it usually you guys are brokering 0-year-old whiskey, or it doesn't really matter what age, but you get a pop every single year kind of in terms of appreciation. Every year that the whiskey is in that barrel, it gets more valuable. And there's an actual index that tracks the value of these whiskeys, right? Every single year. So it's not like it's just a random made up number. Is that how it works in terms of like the basics?
Yeah. Fundamentally, most of our investors come to us because they grow. They're seeking growth, uncorrelated growth and upside in their investments. And so for those people, buying relatively young or especially brand new whiskey is going to be the best bet if they're long-term capital appreciation investors. Some people have different goals. Some people might want a shorter hold, or they might want something a little bit more consistent or predictable and protective. And so maybe they'll buy a 30-year-old barrel that in 5 years will be 35 years old and therefore worth even more. Mega blue chip whiskey is very consistent and predictable. But it totally depends on your strategy as to what makes sense for you. And that's part of my job, is to help understand an individual's investors' needs, goals, and financial situation to make those kinds of recommendations. But I'd say most people that I work with come to me and eventually choose, yes, I want to be in that brand new whiskey, because that way you get sort of that maximum return curve from 0 to however many years you're going. As far as in the interim, how do you value it? Yes, I mean, it would be tough to hold an investment for 15 or 20 years or whatever the number is and not know what it's worth or what it's doing. So part of our job is to provide yearly appraisals, not only for investors, but for us to understand the marketplace, for buyers to be able to understand the marketplace, and of course, for the insurance people to know what they're protecting and how much to pay out. So annual appraisals come along with every barrel that's sold, and we monitor and maintain an index that tracks the broader cask market, which for the last several years has seen fairly consistent 13 to almost 16% annualized returns. But all that means you stay fairly well informed of what your barrels are doing over time.
Got it. And Taylor, just on the flip side, why would a distillery want to sell their barrels instead of selling them retail?
Most of them don't. The reality is this stuff is liquid gold to these distilleries, right? When you put whiskey in a barrel, it gets more valuable over time, as they have found, generally speaking. And they make a lot of money by just letting these things sit and rest and mature. So realistically, distilleries don't want to let their liquid go. But distilleries also have a very challenging business model, especially if you're brand new or relatively young, or if you need capital or you're trying to expand. A distillery in Scotland or Japan, where it's expected that your product be aged a good amount of time, basically have to distill and produce a product, wait 10 years, and then sell it, right? So what do you do for revenues for 10 years while you're building a business? Well, there's a very few options. Banks don't necessarily want to give you a loan that you're not going to pay back for 10 years. So since whiskey has been a major economic force in Scotland hundreds of years, effectively whiskey distilleries have used barrels as bridge capital. They issue these barrels to potential investors or partners in order for them to raise capital so that they can make more whiskey, so that they can hire people, pay for the commodities costs that are increasing significantly, build a visitor center, buy more stills. So they don't want to let go of their whiskey, but they also need capital to build the projects that they need to build and run a business. Make sense?
Yeah, no, it makes I could imagine it being cash flow negative during the months where, I mean, during the years that, they're not actually selling. It's not like they could day one sell the product, which I think complicates things. And this is really the only way they can. The other couple of things I wanted to touch on, this isn't for all investors, right? This is specifically for accredited investors. I believe you guys do a 506C as well, right?
Correct. Yeah, I'm sure you're well acquainted. You deal with them all the time, but the SEC does consider the way that this is handled to be a security, even though it's, a quasi commodity, it's a physical asset. There is a maintenance contract involved. We've got to take care of the whiskey. We've got to insure it. We've got to help you with advisory and management and appraisal. And eventually we also help people sell to transact as a broker. And, given the full scale relationship that we have with our investors, SEC considers this to be a security. And so for that reason, we have issued barrels under a Reg D 506C offering. That means that only accredited investors can participate. Just in case anybody in the audience is not clear, it's not a very complex, hard barrier to entry. It's really just financials. If a person is earning around $200,000 or more in income each year, you're qualified individually. If a spousal couple, a husband or wife together is earning 300 grand per year in income, you're qualified. Or if the person has a net worth of $1 million or more, excluding the residence where they live, then they're also qualified. There's a few other small qualifiers for industry professionals, but for most people that I work with, if you check any one of those boxes, you're eligible.
Got it. Okay. This is one of the most interesting asset classes because it's fairly new in the United States, but this was a much more common in Europe as an asset class, right? In terms of when have people started investing? Because I know you said going back, till, hundreds of years ago, basically in Scotland. When has it gone mainstream, I guess, in Europe? And how do you see, I guess, the next 5 to 10 years here in terms of the growth that you've already been seeing?
Yeah, the last 10 to 15 years have really been the introduction of whiskey barrels through intermediaries like ours, Brayburn, to the general public or retail investors, so to speak. We were one of the first, if not the first, to bring Scotch whiskey in the barrel to the world, starting in the United Kingdom and Europe almost 10 years ago, and have been building from there. Folks in Europe and the UK now sort of know about this. It's something that people are aware of, but in the US, at least, the average individual investor has no idea that this exists. We're in a position right now where so many people are looking to protect and diversify their wealth just because there is so much uncertainty. It's going to be a strange political year. Economics are very unusual. What alternatives and what real assets are you going to use to protect your wealth? And increasingly, people are looking to tangible goods. Interestingly, KPMG, Big Four accounting firm, just released a report yesterday that says that very high net worth investors who are looking at alternatives or real assets, close to 26% of them, which was the number one choice pick, are saying, I want to invest in whiskey. That's their first pick in assets that they want to be buying in order to protect wealth. So it's a new idea to most Americans, but when you think about the fundamentals for most people, it's something that's relatively straightforward and tends to make sense.
Got it. And what is Brayburn's role in the process? Like, obviously, you give access to investors, but there's much more than that, right? Are you as an investor, are you buying it from Brayburn or is strictly a brokered role, warehousing? Can you just shed some light and I guess why would someone go to Brayburn for this access?
Yeah. So we're a pretty full service investment management firm. We're not just selling you a barrel and then disappearing. A barrel does require care and it requires expertise to manage. And that's why not only administratively, regulatorily, but on the ground, taking care of the whiskey, rotating it around the warehouse, testing it, make sure it's maturing well, monitoring it, maybe putting it in a new barrel. So we need to be involved with every step of the process for our investors, from step one, education, step two, onboarding and buying your first barrels. Step three is the long wait and maintenance, and we take care of all of that and protection through insurance. Eventually, the last step for most people is going to be getting out of their investment, whether that's selling the barrels to make a profit or putting it into bottles just so they can enjoy it on a personal level or give it to friends or gifts or give it to their clients. We help with all of that. We will help people sell their barrels and take home their profits or their returns, their realized proceeds. And we're there every step of the way. That's our job, is to be your guide in the whiskey market, which is otherwise a pretty impenetrable place to access.
Thanks, Taylor. In terms of, I think you mentioned insurance a couple of times. How does insurance work in the whiskey world?
Insurance is there to protect against physical hazards, right? If there's a fire at the warehouse, if forklift knocks over your barrel and it leaks all the whiskey everywhere, if anything physically happens to the barrel, you're covered to some degree. Some barrels are going to be covered for the current year value as they appreciate over time. Some barrels are going to be covered for the initial value, which is what you paid for it. So if something happens, you get your money back, of course. But all of these are physical assets. And so you should take care of them and protect them from these physical hazards, which is one of the main risks in anything tangible, which is why we've put insurance in place to manage that risk and take care of investors if anything were to happen.
So in a situation where, let's say, I buy a barrel, figuratively speaking, $5,000 barrel. I get insurance for $5,000. In 10 years, that's way more expensive than a $5,000 barrel. Do you redo the insurance at that point, or do you redo insurance every year? How does that work in a situation like that?
Yeah, in the situations in the barrels where they're covered for the annual value every single year. Part of the reason we do an appraisal every year is so that the insurance people know exactly what they owe the investor if something were to happen. So they're appraised annually, and that goes to the insurance coverage and premiums as well.
So between I guess, your full service shop and then the insurance, what are the annual holding costs for, investing in a barrel of whiskey? And obviously you wouldn't do a barrel because there are certain minimums you have to hit, right? But let's say, 50,000, because that's usually the real estate world. I believe it's similar in your world. Let's say you have $50,000 worth of barrels. Or let's say 100,000, because that's always easier for administrative purposes. What am I paying every year in administrative costs?
Yeah, depends, again, on the situation. Right now, the maximum is going to be $100 per barrel per year, which is pretty good, relatively speaking. And the minimum is going to be zero. Some barrels have all of their costs built in on day one. It's part of the initial entry price. And then some of them have that small annual cost associated, which covers all of the maintenance. So it's a pretty light investment in terms of load or costs.
Okay, and that $100 covers your share, your end as well.
All of it.
Wow.
Yep.
Yeah, no, that's super efficient. Now, do the barrels always get stored at the warehouses, or do they sometimes get stored at the original distillery as well?
Both. So we primarily, again, recommend people working with our partner distilleries where you're going to get the best deal and get your whiskey when it's the youngest or even new. So those distilleries that we're partnered with, they're going to hold your barrels on site at the distillery, which also means if you want to go to Scotland, you can and should visit them. These distilleries are beautiful, but they're held on site at the distillery. If we're reaching out to some other distillery that we're not necessarily partnered with, they might end up in our company warehouse or a third-party warehouse, just depending on logistics, but it depends on what you're acquiring. They do legally have to stay in these government bonded, audited, controlled, insured warehouses because these are very highly regulated spirits markets. The industry and these governments want to protect the quality, the heritage, and the reputation of their whiskey. They are not going to let you take these barrels home and put them in your apartment in New York or your basement in New Jersey. Unfortunately, they do have to stay where they are, which is for the best interest of everybody involved and the eventual consumer.
Got it. But there is a way of eventually taking them out. It just they wouldn't be Scottish whiskey anymore, right? Because it has to be. That was an interesting fact that when I visited you guys is actually that the moment you take Scottish whiskey, a barrel out, you lose the term Scottish whiskey at that point, right? I find fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, the definition of Scotch whiskey and Japanese whiskey now is it has to be distilled, created in Scotland. It has to be stored in Scotland its entire life in these regulated warehouses, and it has to be bottled in Scotland or Japan. So if you fail any one of those tests, you do not have Scotch whiskey or you do not have Japanese whiskey. Now, if you smuggled a barrel of, Scotch in your luggage back to the United States and aged it or bottled it here, yeah, it's not Scotch anymore and loses a ton of value. But realistically, given the controls, you'd have to have a hell of a heist in order to get the whiskey out of the control rooms and across the ocean. The only way realistically, logistically for that to happen, for you to get your whiskey over the ocean, is to put it in bottles in situ in Scotland or Japan, which is how people are generally going to do it.
Got it. Okay. It's fascinating. The other thing that we talked about a little bit, and this is one of my favorite topics in alternative assets, is collateral. Is the ability of taking something that has value here, collateralizing it, and then putting it into other investments. Can you shed some light a little bit on it has and this is not you providing financial advice. like is whiskey, can you collateralize whiskey? Does it have the same kind of collateral effects as, collateralizing some gold that you own or some similar asset?
Yeah. So we don't provide that service. We're not an issuer of debt or credit or anything like that, but it is possible. I've actually had conversations with quite a few people, both internationally and here in the United States. There are a couple of banks that actually do a lot of whiskey collateralization and lending, specifically mostly in America, because obviously American banks like to work with Americans, but there's folks that have told us, yeah, we'd love to break into the Scottish and Japanese markets. It's premium stuff. It's going to increase in value, generally speaking, as time goes on, which is great for them and their ability to make their loans back. But whiskey is, at the end of the day, a tangible asset. Historically, it tends to appreciate faster than your rate of interest, so it can be a good deal for everybody. I met a hedge fund manager the other week who is doing that on a big deal. I think it's $100 million of bourbon sitting here, and he got an insurance policy against his whiskey so that he technically cannot lose money no matter what. And then he got a bank to lend against it, and then he reinvested his money into some other asset class and deal. So he made out pretty well with an interesting deal structure. But there are definitely ways to accomplish that. It's a tangible good with great value no matter what.
And how does whiskey compare to other liquid assets like wine, like fine wine? I would even almost put like art, collectibles, cars. How does it compare pros and cons to some of these other, I guess, fine luxury
Mhm.
asset classes? I don't know if that's the word you would use.
Yeah, I would say, whiskey is a premium to luxury commodity, depending on how long you get to hold it. Realistically, all of these things that you're talking about are interesting and potentially great ways to diversify. I personally used to work in fine art investment, and I can confidently say if you can afford $5 to $10 million paintings, you're probably going to make good money on them. The challenge is, of course, getting to that point where you can do that. Whiskey's got some unique elements to it. Whiskey is one of very few assets in the world that actually gets better with age, right? It improves when you let it sit in a barrel. It's a better product every day, according to people who enjoy whiskey. Art doesn't actually get better. It actually can get worse because it physically degrades. Real estate tends to get worse over time. Jewelry can corrode. There are very few things that actually improve over time, which is one of the reasons why whiskey tends to be one of the most high performing alts out there. An interesting difference between whiskey and wine. Wine does some aging in a barrel, but actually wine also can age in the bottle. The challenge, or one of the main distinctions why a lot of wine people like to get into whiskey as well as investments, is because wine maturation can be a little bit unpredictable, as well as the wine vintage. 1 year of a field's output or a vineyard's output in wine can be totally different from the next due to rain or terroir, the acidity of the soil, the grape yield, or all these things. So 1 year to the next can be very different and unpredictable. Wherein with whiskey, because it's so, distilled and you really get the spirit down to its elements and very carefully managed in how it's created, you get a lot more predictability and consistency year over year. So people lean on it as relatively predictable. But all these things honestly complement each other. For people that get into alternatives, whiskey tends to, again, make sense and be straightforward in the value proposition. But for a lot of people, I think they can complement each other. If you're in one, you probably should be in the other.
Makes complete sense. The other thing I wanted to shed some light on is, I guess, the number of distilleries that are out there. I know in the United States, probably 2 decades ago, it was the craft beer revolution, and there's a brewery, in every single town, probably even two or three, and most are not doing very well financially. How does this compare with distilleries? Like I remember you went over the facts on when we stopped by, and I was surprised of how the numbers were not really that high at all. So, can you shed some light on the number of distilleries that are in Japan, Scotland? How many actually open up on a given basis? How many close? And after that, I kind of want to get into what happens if you invest in a barrel that is in a new distillery that ends up closing. What does that actually look like?
Yeah. Good question. One of the reasons why we focus on or recommend Scotch and Japanese whiskey is because of the supply and demand imbalances in production versus how much people want to consume eventually. America is a huge whiskey producing nation, It's something like 1,000 distilleries in the whiskey business alone, whiskey and bourbon in America. So massive production, and their whiskey is primarily consumed in America as well. It's not a major export. People outside of America don't really like bourbon or whiskey at all from America, to be honest. Now, people can and do make money on American whiskey barrels. It absolutely can and does happen. We're close with some of the bigger financiers in the American whiskey space who have generally told us, we've made good money on American whiskey the last couple of years, but our concern is that there is so much production in so many of these small distilleries coming online right now. They're producing liquid that doesn't necessarily have an end node. How is this and where is this going to sell to? So that's a big question right now. Is this going to correct in American whiskey? Supply and demand now maybe shifting the other way where we're overproducing here in America. So 1,000 distilleries in America. In Scotland, there are 150 or so distilleries, period. Most of them are making middle shelf stuff. The premium single malt distilleries are the top shelf upper end of the market. That's closer to 40. 40 distilleries in Scotland making billions of dollars worth of product that goes all over the world. Now, for context, one of the reasons why Japanese whiskey is going to be the most expensive and hard to find stuff on the planet when you go to the liquor store is versus the 40 single malt Scotch distilleries in Scotland. There are 15 single malt Japanese whiskey distilleries feeding the entire world. For comparison, we're now paired or partnered with Karuizawa, which is Japan's rarest and most expensive whiskey distillery. Extremely exciting, wonderful place, great whiskey, but they're extremely small batch. They're artisans, they're very skilled craftsmen and technicians. The Macallan distillery in Scotland, one of the world's best known and best selling whiskeys, produces about 15 million liters of the stuff of whiskey every single year. 15 million liters of whiskey from Macallan. In comparison, the rarest Japanese whiskey distillery that we work with, Karuizawa, produces 100,000 liters of whiskey, which is, a couple hundred barrels of the stuff, period. So the scales on which these operate versus the demand is really what makes it such a relatively high performing asset for our investors over the years. And supply and demand imbalances in Scotland and Japan do not seem to be getting better or flipping in the same way that they have or look to be in America. So that's why we're comfortable and confident in these premium spaces.
And Taylor, just for a frame of reference, how many of these distilleries are opening up every single, in a given year, and how many are closing?
That's a good, interesting question. America sees a lot of closures just because the competition is fierce, and I mean it's hard. It's a hard market to distinguish yourselves with 1,000 competitors. In Scotland, you can actually there's a great annual industry review book that you can look through and see what distilleries have been closed or mothballed for various reasons. There were a couple of closures in the 80s just because there were a little bit of a pullback. They call it the whiskey loch, the whiskey hole in Scotland in the late 80s. But since that time, since basically the 1990s and the 30 years after 95, there has not been a single closure due to failure to thrive or lack of a market in Scotland. So it's a fairly surefire bet to make a Scotch whiskey distillery. Obviously, you got to make good whiskey and do the work and build your brand. But we just don't see closures. There's so many people that want great whiskey and not enough places to supply them. So the markets are propped up very well. There have been a few closures basically of the big mega giants closing their factories for blending production, but that's just to shift supply, from one part of the country to another for industrial or economic reasons to make production simpler. They're not actual single malt distilleries that are closing because nobody wants to drink their whiskey. They're, decisions made in boardrooms in London and Tokyo and Shanghai, where a lot of distilleries are now controlled by the big giants.
And Taylor, what I found interesting was, I think the question was, what happens if you buy one of these barrels from a newer distillery, right? Because that's really, just to clarify, a lot of the, you have access to the bigger names, but it's really the newer distilleries like we went over that really have the need to sell these barrels young. And if one of them does go out of business, I found that I remember what you told me was that will only make that barrel so much more rarer. And I thought that was it's amazing when your investment has that kind of downside
Yeah,
protection.
right. Yeah, look, I mean, nobody obviously can predict the future. We prefer to work with younger, growing distilleries because when your business is growing faster, public perception, the value of your product increases faster than everything else on the shelf around it. Your investors and the owners of the commodity, our barrel owners and investors, tend to do better than the rest. So that's why we recommend it for most people who are in it for long-term growth. Now, we very specifically selected the partners that we want to work with based on looking at their finances, their branding, their marketing, their leadership team, making sure these are business leaders who have built strong businesses for decades now. So we're very confident that these distilleries will be very successful in the long term. Plus the fact that it's pretty hard to let your distillery go defunct, as we found over the last 30 years of no closures in Scotland. But if something happened and a distillery did decide to close, well, what does that mean for people that own their barrels? You now own one of a extremely small number of products that will never ever be created again. One of the reasons why the Karazawa distillery is Japan's most esteemed, rarest, and legendary is because it actually did shut down for a period of years in the early 2000s. They had to. Japanese whiskey was, and the Japanese economy was having a tough time. And they shut down. And in the 10 to 15 years after that, their whiskey now is no longer available. So the people that own their barrels now own and control extraordinary liquid from a place where you can't get the stuff anymore. So that's why those barrels end up going for millions of dollars. Those bottles ends up going for tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars per bottle. So owning a scarce asset that can never ever exist again is potentially actually not a bad strategy. Although obviously we want our distillery partners to succeed and thrive over the years. We see it again and again. There are places like Port Ellen in Scotland that close, some of the rarest, most expensive esteemed whiskeys out there, and a handful of other ones as well. Rosebank is another great example in Scotland.
Interesting. No, I love that. I love that downside protection. And obviously you never want the business to fail, but it's nice to know that it's not like you're just gonna go and your barrel's missing that day because your barrel's insured and it'll just be transferred over to a warehouse at that point, and then you can continue the growth that way. One of the things that SIH we always preach is building. What kind of relationship building is in this space? Are you, if you own a barrel in let's say you own 10 barrels in a new distillery, are you gonna get communication on the distillery's performance, or is it really a relationship with you guys? Is the brokers, is it really that you could just show up to Scotland, with prior notice and say, hey, I really want to check out this distillery that I have 10 barrels from or 100 barrels from? Like, what kind of relationship building can an investor expect in this space?
Yeah, you can be as involved as you want. One of the reasons why people really enjoy this is because, I mean, at the end of the day, for a lot of people, whiskey is a hobby and a passion. And so you can be hands off and low maintenance if you want, let it sit in your portfolio and don't worry about it. But realistically, especially when you're working with the distilleries that we're directly partnered with, our dealer distilleries, we want you to get involved. We are hopefully going to be doing an investor trip later this year or early next year to bring folks to Scotland and Japan. Some of our distillery partners have five-star restaurants and hotels. They're wonderful places led by great people, and they're family businesses. We only work with family businesses, and investors who come on as cask owners are now part of the family. So that is an important part of the journey. I think it's really incredible, especially for people who love whiskey, to know that, when you're buying whiskey barrels from us, you're directly funding these people's businesses. They're helping them build their dreams. They're helping them feed local families who work for them. You're growing local economies in Scotland and Japan. So you get to be an incredible part of that journey. Whereas if you're buying some secondary market cask from some trader out there, you're just feeding the broker's bottom line. So that's another reason why we prefer to work directly as a dealer with these distilleries, which nobody else really does.
Awesome. Well, Taylor, I want to be respectful of your hour. Why don't you tell people where they can connect with you, and hopefully, we get a couple of people to reach out.
Yeah. I'm sure you can put up some links for us, Dennis, but we're again here in Midtown Manhattan with the Braeburn Whiskey Vault, which is behind me. Happy to host anybody for a dram that's interested or curious, or just wants to learn something new about something they never gotten into before. So we'd love to see anybody. My personal contact information and website will be below. You can find us at braeburnwhiskey.com. Just know that whiskey is spelled with no E in Scotland or Japan. And if you need anything, find a time and we'd be glad to host you. We work with people from all over the world, all over the country, so you don't need to be in New York to be a barrel owner or investor. But get in touch. I'd love to meet you if you're curious to learn about whiskey.
And I highly recommend the tour. I've done it with a couple of my investors, and Taylor is beyond informative, and I learned a ton about whiskey that day. So Taylor is always gracious with his time. Thank you so much, Taylor, for being on.
Thanks for having me, Dennis. Great to be here.